Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Rowley, and I'm the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Central Library, which is hosting our presentation today. A few logistical matters to start. As an attendee, you are muted, so if you would like to ask a question or provide a comment, please place that in the question or chat panel that you see. We are also recording this seminar, so if you have to step away for a moment or if you would like to share this with a colleague afterwards, it'll be on the library's YouTube channel. And with that, if you are having any audio issues or visual issues, as in you can't see the slides or you can't hear me, try logging off and logging back on. I'll put these kind of instructions in the chat as well. And if you will focus on the chat for a moment, there should be a link there that says follow along here at the presentation link. So if you would like to follow along, I'm going to put that back in the chat, and I will do so periodically because as people trickle in, they might miss this. So the presentation, you can follow along at this NOAA GitHub link. So please use that. It will have all of the links accessible that our speaker is talking over. So with those out of the way, I want to welcome you to the State of the Ecosystem, the 2022 Overview by Kimberly Bastille. Kimberly is the scientific data analyst working in ecosystem assessment reporting in the Ecosystem Dynamics and Assessment branch, and she currently focuses on the state of the ecosystem reports and related projects. And I will turn it over to Kim.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Bastille, as she said. I'm just going to give a quick overview of the 2022 State of the Ecosystem reports. And I just wanted to give a huge shout out to the editors and other leads of this project, Sarah Gachis, Sean Lucy, Garrett Piper, Kim Hyde, Laurel Smith, and Scott Large. So now we'll dive in. So the State of the Ecosystem reports are really designed to improve ecosystem information and synthesis for fisheries managers. It uses an integrated ecosystem assessment approach, which is shown in that circle on the right. It has 5 stages: defining goals and targets, developing indicators, assessing ecosystem, risk analysis, and management strategy evaluation. The State of the Ecosystem reports fall under the develop indicators and assess ecosystem sections of the loop, but the work that we do here feeds into the later steps as well. We link management objectives to ecosystem indicators, and I'll explain that in a moment. We produce 2 annual reports that have been evolving since about 2016, and they're really designed to give contextual information and a fisheries relevant subset of a full ecosystem status report to our target audiences. The State of the Ecosystems also have an emphasis on open science. So as Katie said, the link to this will be in the chat, and everything in red is a live link to a resource that might be useful for anyone who's interested. So the structure of the reports, they start out with a graphical summary, and I'll show you an example of these in a second. The first page is a report card style table that reports on the management objectives using some indicators that we've developed. So the table on the right shows those. So things like seafood production, we use landings and commercial and recreational harvest for those. Things like stability, we're looking at diversity indicators, both of fisheries stability and of ecosystem stability, et cetera. And I'll walk through those in specifics in a few slides. The second part of the graphical summary is the risk to meeting management objectives. It's just a bulleted list of kind of major takeaways of what's happening in the system. And then the last page is a description of our synthesis themes, which I'll show you as well. The main body of the report has 2 sections: performance relative to management objectives, where we look into those indicators. What is the indicator saying? Is it increasing, decreasing, staying the same? And then we talk a little bit about why we think that is, and that is where we integrate the synthesis themes. These are multiple system drivers, regime shifts, and ecosystem reorganization, and I'll explain those further. The final section of the report is risks to meeting management objectives. And we've chosen two main risks: climate change and other ocean uses, or offshore wind development. And I'll explain those in further detail later. You're not meant to be able to read this. This is just a visual of the graphical summary. It's visually distinct from the rest of the report, and it's kind of a, if you read no further, here are the snapshots. The panel on the left shows the summary table where we talk about the trends and the current status. Is it above or below the long-term mean? And then we just give a couple sentences about the implications of that status and trend. And then, like I said, the bulleted list of risks is on the right there. The final section of the graphical summary is the synthesis themes. And here we're really trying to characterize ecosystem change for management, or fisheries management specifically. The panel on the lower left shows the multiple system drivers visualization that we came up with. And this is societal, biological, physical, and chemical factors that could influence marine ecosystems through a variety of different pathways. So with this, we tried to show that within each kind of factor, they can influence each other, and then the system as a whole can also influence any other factor in the system. Changes in multiple system drivers could lead to a regime shift, a large, abrupt, and persistent change in the structure and function of the ecosystem. And then these regime shifts and changes in system drivers could interact and create a ecosystem reorganization. So the lower right panel shows regime 1, which is characterized by a certain set of species having certain interactions with each other and with humans. We would cross some critical threshold and then be in a regime 2, characterized by a different set of species and a different set of interactions that we, as people who use the system and other species in the system, would have to adapt to. So just to kind of take a step back as to what the state of ecosystems do, we report on 3 ecological production units, which is what we call these large ecosystems. The Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council receives the Mid-Atlantic State of the Ecosystem, and that covers the Mid-Atlantic Bight. The New England Fisheries Management Council receives a report that's reporting on the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank ecological production units. For figures, we've developed a style that shows trends that are assessed on time series that are longer than 30 years. If the time series is significantly increasing, you'll see an orange line. If it's decreasing, you'll see a purple line. If there's no trend line, then it's either non-significant or less than 30 years. And because we have time series that are varying in length, we've highlighted the last 10 years in this light gray shade, just to help you orient as well. So now I'm going to dive into the body of the reports, and just a heads up, both of these reports get a full hour to their target audiences. So for this presentation, I've just grabbed examples from both. So if you're looking for a more cohesive story about one of the systems, I recommend reading that full report, which is linked at the end. But I'll try to tell you where we're at throughout the presentation. So now we're in the performance relative to management objectives, where we have these management objectives, which are outlined by national legislation, and they're things from that table that I showed prior. So the first one is seafood production, and right now we're looking at New England. For this management objective, the indicators that we're using are commercial landings and recreational seafood harvest. The figures on the left are grayed out because for this year we don't have an updated data set for including 2020 information. Right now we're working to create a catch accounting and monitoring system, and at the time of these reports the data wasn't available at the ecological production unit level, but that should be up for next year, and then we can report on what's happening in 2020. So the black line there is the total landings combined for all species, and the red is just from the species that are managed by the New England Council. As you can see that those are declining. We don't expect whatever 2020 held to change those long-term trends. So that's pretty fixed. The recreational seafood harvest is also declining. That does have updated data, and 2020 was the lowest point of the time series. We also looked at recreational shark landings. It looks like for a couple categories, they've been decreasing over the last few years, but no overall trends there. There was a full report put out on how COVID impacted the seafood industry for our region and for all of the others. So if you're interested in that, it's linked on slide 8. So we report on what's happening. So we can see that the landings are declining, the recreational harvest is declining. All of that is below the long-term mean. So the next question we ask is why? And these are really answered probably in a mix of interactions. It could be things like ecosystem and stock production, things like management actions, market drivers, or environmental change. So in the reports we dive in, we look at stock status and biomass by guild and many other things. So that way we can give some implications as to why we think these landings are down over time. The next management objective is commercial profits. And again, we're in New England for this. The indicators that we're looking at are revenue and the Bennett index, which is revenue broken out by price and volume component. Again, the black line is overall for all species, and the red line is managed by the New England Council. These are also grayed out for the same reason as the landings. We just don't have data at the EPU level for this yet. The figure on the far left is for Georges Bay, and you can see that they're kind of cyclical, goes through periods of higher revenue and periods of lower revenue. And this is really due to a fluctuation in the rotational management areas of sea scallops. In the Gulf of Maine, the overall revenue is pretty high, but for managed species, it's declining, and that's because that is driven by lobsters in the Gulf of Maine, and those are not managed by the New England Fisheries Management Council. This can also be shown in the Bennett indicator. So that top column, or I'm sorry, the top row is Georges Bay, and it's really driven by that orange category, which is benthos, which is where ski scallops fall into, while the row below that is really driven by that purple category, and that is benthivores, which is the category that lobsters fall into. Shifting now to the Mid-Atlantic, the next management objective is recreational opportunities. The indicators that we're using are recreational effort and recreational fleet diversity. So the effort in that top figure is number of angler trips. As you can see, that's increasing, and we're above the long-term mean there. Well, even though the number of angler trips are increasing, the diversity of the angler fleet is decreasing. And we believe that that's due to a shift from party charters to shore-based angling. And this could have impacts on how fisheries managers choose to manage certain species, as shore-based anglers will have access to different stocks or potentially smaller individuals of a certain species. Back to New England now, we're looking at stability. Stability has a few categories underneath it. Fisheries stability, we're looking at commercial species revenue diversity and recreational species catch diversity. The fleet diversity revenue for commercial fisheries does not have a trend line on it because it's fewer than 30 years, but we're at a pretty low point in the overall time series. And we believe that that's due to just the small number of species that are really driving revenue in those areas. The recreational catch diversity is increasing, and we believe that that is due to an increase in warmer water species moving in to that area. Ecological stability is measured in a couple ways. I just grabbed one example here of the expected number of species from the bottom trawl survey. This is broken out into two categories when we were using the Albatross as the vessel that we ran the survey on. And then in the blue, it's when we switched over to the Bigelow. There's no correction factor for expected number of species, so they're run separately. But that increasing trend in the albatross years in the Gulf of Maine, we also believe is due to warm water species moving in to the Gulf. Back to the Mid-Atlantic now. I'm sorry for bouncing around so much. This objective is social justice, social vulnerability, and environmental justice. The indicator on the left is commercial engagement and reliance on fisheries. Commercial engagement is a calculation comprised of the number of dealers, the number of permits, etc. And then that number per capita is how we get reliance. So just a little description here. Something like Cape May is a highly engaged community and also a highly reliant community because it falls over these dashed lines. Whereas Hoboken, North Carolina is highly reliant on fisheries, but not very highly engaged in fisheries. To dive in deeper into the environmental justice categories of these communities, we're looking at personal disruption, population composition, and a poverty index. And anytime that those communities fall higher than a 1 on the spider chart, it means that they have environmental justice concerns. These communities will likely be less able to adapt to change, whether that change is coming from management regulations or to climate change or other factors. The final management objective is protected species, and this also has a couple of categories. The first one is to maintain bycatch below certain thresholds. Here we're looking at harbor porpoise and gray seal bycatch. This is also grayed out because we don't have updated data for this for the most recent years. The way to read these figures is that dashed line is an annual estimate. The blue line is a 5-year rolling mean. And the red line there is the potential biological removals, which we're using as the threshold. So for both harbor porpoise and gray seal, we're currently meeting those objectives. The downward trend in harbor porpoise is due to a decrease in harbor porpoise abundance in our waters, which was then reducing the likelihood that there's going to be interaction with fisheries and fishing gear. The opposite trend is true for gray seals. They're increasing on the shelf, and thus increasing the likelihood that they'll come into contact with fisheries activity. The final part of the protected species objective is to recover endangered species, and here we're looking at the North Atlantic right whale. Up until about 2009, 2010, they were on a recovery trajectory, but they've been declining in the last decade or so. The lower figure shows the calf abundance, where it was declining from, again, about 2008, 2009, to the point in 2018 where there was no calves born on the shelf that year. But it seems like we may be turning the corner around that, where in 2021 there was an estimated 18 calves born for that year. The population declines in North Atlantic right whales is a combination of many factors: fisheries interactions, ship strikes, copepod availability, distribution ships of their prey. And we expect that those there could be potentially more stress added with the development of offshore wind, as we know that some of those regions with wind lease areas overlap with migratory corridors or foraging habitat for right whales. We also report on other protected species, including unusual mortality events for 3 other whale species. So that was the first part of the body of the report. A really quick overview, just looking at certain indicators for certain regions. Now we'll dive into the risks to meeting those management objectives. And this has 2 sections to it: climate change and ecosystem productivity, and then other ocean uses, offshore wind. So I know that there is a ton of information on this slide, but we'll try to summarize it. Here are the indicators that we're looking at are surface and bottom temperature and marine heat waves. The figure on the upper left shows the average for 2021 what was happening in the ecosystem for a temperature anomaly. And as you can see, fall was very warm, but 3 out of the 4 seasons are increasing in the long term for sea surface temperature. The figure on the lower left shows a bottom temperature anomaly. The black line is the in situ bottom temperature, and a red line is the modeled bottom temperature, again, increasing over time. The marine heat wave indicators, we look at a couple different factors for this. The figure on the upper right shows just for 2021. The blue line there is the long-term average. The black line is the threshold, which is the 90th percentile of that long-term average. And then the red line is the temperature for 2021. And as you can see, for fall, we were in a heat wave state for most of that season. Below that is the maximum and cumulative intensity, which is a time series of marine heat waves, looking at it in kind of 2 different factors, and both of these are increasing over time. I chose these for the Mid-Atlantic just to save some space on the slide, but all of these trends are also true for Georges Bank and Gulf of Maine, and specifically the marine heat waves are even more dramatic in the New England regions. Another way to explore climate change is through ocean currents. The figure on the upper left is a position anomaly of the Gulf Stream Index, showing that the Gulf Stream Index is pushing further north over time. And this instability has fallout for other indicators as well. So on the lower left, we're looking at the slope water proportions of the Northeast Channel. And that's a calculation of waters coming into the Northeast Channel entering the Gulf of Maine. And as you can see, the last few years, there's been almost no cold slope water coming down from the Labrador Current. And most of that has been warm, salty water coming from the Gulf Stream. This could have impacts on many of the species in the Gulf of Maine that need that cold, nutrient dense water coming down from Canada. The instability of the Gulf Stream could also influence the warm core ring bursts. This is an example of a regime shift. As you can see, up until about 2000, we were in a state of fewer warm core rings born on the shelf each year, born on the shelf break each year, and now we're in a position of more. One thing to note is that at one point in June of 2021, there was 8 rings on observed in 1 week. So that's pretty wild. The main concern about warm core rings is that if they get onto the shelf, they're bringing warm water, salty water, and its associated species, which could have interactions with many of the managed species on the shelf. This could also impact the cold pool, which is a cold body of water that forms the spring, summer, and fall months in the Mid-Atlantic. There's kind of hard to read, but the main takeaway here is that the cold pool is getting warmer, it's shorter in duration, and it's smaller in overall footprint. And that could be detrimental because many species use the cold pool for spawning habitat. It's cold and nutrient dense. It's important for phytoplankton production and many other things along the shelf. Another factor in climate change is ocean acidification. In this figure, this map just shows some glider trawls and some other studies that have been done looking at pH across the shelf. And those areas of lower pH are known surf clam habitat. And there's been some lab studies that look at when exactly we should be concerned and when surf clams and other species will start to feel those impacts from ocean acidification. Here we're looking at climate change in the estuarine habitat, specifically the Chesapeake Bay, which is an important area for many species, commercial and recreational, that use it as spawning or nursery habitat. The map there shows that it was warmer than average in the winter months, and this could have impacts on things like striped bass, which don't deal as well with the warm water during that time. but then is more beneficial for something like a blue crab, which will see a population bloom when it's warm in those times. We also included a new indicator this year, submerged aquatic vegetation. And as you can see in the tidal fresh areas of the Chesapeake, there's more SAV over time, and we believe that that's due to some restoration efforts that have been underway there. In the high salinity areas, there's no trend. We believe that that's due to warming in those areas and its effect on eelgrass populations. The overall water quality of the Chesapeake has also been increasing. And again, we believe that's due to some restoration efforts that have been happening, as well as a reduction in nutrient outflow from the land, and that feeds into the Chesapeake. So moving more towards ecosystem productivity, obviously this is fed a lot by the indicators that we have already gone over, but now we're looking at chlorophyll, primary production, and a phytoplankton size class analysis. For chlorophyll A, that figure on the upper left, there was relatively short blooms in the fall, and for most of the summer and spring, we were below average. For primary productivity, we were also at or below average for most of the year, especially in those summer months. And that could have impact as the summer is when most other species are doing their heavy feeding and putting on weight to survive the winter. The phytoplankton size class is an indicator that we just started including last year and have updated a little bit for this year. The microplankton, that teal color, really dominate in the winter and fall, but during the summer, the smaller phytoplankton, that nanoplankton or orange color, is dominating during those months. And we believe that the increased productivity of the smaller phytoplankton could imply a less efficient transfer of primary production up to those higher trophic levels, again, as that's the time that many things are feeding heavily. Another way to look at ecosystem productivity is to look at a forage fish energy density analysis that this time series, as you can see, is pretty short, but we're adding to it every year. The major takeaway here is that there's variability in seasonal and annual energy density of different forage fish species. The main takeaway could also be that the Atlantic herring are about half as energy dense as they were compared to studies done in the 80s and 90s. So this could have impacts on many managed species, as lots of things use herring as a corner of their diet. The indicators here that we're looking at are fish condition and a fish productivity anomaly. Fish condition is the kind of fatness measure of a fish, with the idea that a heavier fish will be in better condition, it'll be able to feed better, it'll have better reproductive success, and have a better chance overwintering. As you can see, that final column for 2021 shows that most of those species were in a below average or a poor condition. This is an ongoing project looking into what are the drivers of these, and some preliminary results show that some of these changes could be due to temperature, zooplankton abundance, fishing pressure, and population size. But more work is being done on that, and I'm sure we'll report on that in the coming years. Another indicator is the small fish per large fish biomass, and this is taken for a few species, but the cumulative line is that black line there, and as you can see, it's been decreasing over the last 15 years or so, so that's something to keep an eye on as well. Now we're into ecosystem structure, which is related to the climate change and ecosystem productivity sections of the report. We're looking at overall species distribution, and this is an aggregate for all the species from the bottom trawl survey. And that a long shelf distance is actually those species moving further north over time, while they're actually moving deeper in the water column. And species moving as a whole could have impacts for both fishing interactions, as well as species interactions in those systems. We're also looking at predator status and predator trends. The figure on the left is the number of sharks catch per unit effort for a few different shark categories. As you can see, there's no overall trend from there. The figure on the right is a stock status for highly migratory species, and I apologize that those are in abbreviations there, but the link, the HMS.codes link, holds a table that gives you the full write-out of what all of those species are. Main takeaways are that there's no trend in aggregate sharks, and the highly migratory species populations are mostly at or above the target. A stable predator population would mean a stable predation pressure. But as I said during the protected species section just before this, there's an increasing seal population, and that could have impacts on increased predator pressure for many managed species, as seals are pretty generalist predators that feed on many of the managed stocks in the region. So this is a habitat and climate vulnerability analysis that was done, and we've mapped that to climate sensitive species analysis that were done a few years prior. So the way to use this table, the species and the habitats in red, orange are more vulnerable to climate change. So you can see these species down and the life stages down on the left, and then you can map those over to areas of interest and see where certain species during certain life stages are most vulnerable and what habitats they will be existing in during those times. So that was climate change as a risk to meeting management objectives. There's a ton that goes into that, and obviously more work is being done. The other risk to meeting management objectives is other ocean uses, specifically offshore wind, which is projected to really explode on the Northeast Shelf over the next decade or so. The indicators here are a development timeline and fisheries and community-specific revenue from wind lease areas. The figure on the top left is the proposed wind development. And as you can see, by 2030, we're looking at almost 2 million acres covered by wind in the on the Northeast Shelf. The point up here at kind of 2031 is not actually a hard 2031. That's more of like 2030 plus, as more projects will continue to be developed past the 2030, past the end of the decade timeline. The figure below that is the fisheries revenue from wind lease areas, and we pulled the top 5 species whose revenue is from those wind lease areas, and it's some very commercially and recreationally important species, things like longfin squid, monkfish, ocean quahog, summer flounder, and surf clams, which we've talked about before. Another new indicator this year is the port revenue from wind energy areas. And the way to read this figure is that the lightest blue is revenue from non-wind areas, where the darkest blue is revenue from the wind lease areas. We took a range of years, so the min to max range for those years is shown in that medium blue. The icons, the triangles, and the circles are environmental justice concerns. So the triangles show communities that have medium to high environmental justice concerns, and the circles show communities with medium to high gentrification concerns. So as in the management objective, we're trying to indicate which communities may be more or less likely to adapt to the changes from wind, from climate, and from management actions. And then the last part of offshore wind development, this is kind of hard to read, but there's a full page of it in the reports themselves, is the timeline and the footprint of where these projects are under development or will be under development along the shelf. The major implications here are that the current plans for a rapid build out of about 2 million acres by the end of the decade will create a patchwork across the shelf, and that could have impacts on how impacts are distributed throughout the communities along that coastline. The development will also have impacts on the species, negatively affecting species that prefer soft bottom while potentially benefiting species that prefer a hard bottom, and that up to 20% of annual commercial landings and revenue from the Mid-Atlantic occur in these wind lease areas. So as that effort is shifted into different areas, it will have different impacts that we're trying to predict. There's a ton of work going on offshore wind, so I expect that we'll be reporting more on this in future years. There's also some other factors affecting things like the science that we report to the councils, as this patchwork will also affect the scientific survey section of the system. So that was the very quick summary of kind of blips and blurbs from different pulled from different sections of the two different reports. I just wanted to give a huge shout out to the over 60 people that contribute their data, their expertise, and their time to help us build these out for the fisheries managers every year. So thank you all so much to these folks. It's truly an amazing effort that goes into this. Here are just some references and links to everything that I think you could possibly need. There was a special issue that came out on integrated ecosystem assessments, which definitely has a lot of information about these projects in there. This year's reports are available online at these links. The technical documentation, which outlines all the methodologies for all of these indicators and all of this data. The indicator catalog is a deeper dive into certain indicators that weren't able to include this year, and some that just need more context that we're not able to give in these relatively short reports. The Ecodata R package is an R package that holds all of the data and processing and everything for these reports, and then all these visualizations, which holds all the figures that you've seen here and more. The presentations for this presentation, as well as what was given to the councils and the science and statistical committees, are also available online. And if you have any questions post this, please shoot me an email and I'll try to point you in the right direction. Thanks for listening to me ramble on, and we can take questions now if that works.
Yes, thank you so much, Kim. Actually, Kim, if you want to go back to that last slide, just so people have that up in their face and they can figure out what links they want to follow through on. And I will remind everyone that the links and the presentation that Kim has been showing is linked in the chat if you want to visit that or share that around with your colleagues. So moving into questions. So our first question is this analysis just descriptive or prescriptive?
Great question. I think that we're trying to give context to fisheries managers. We're not trying to tell them what decisions to make. We're trying to give them as much ecosystem information and as much context as we can. And there's some work, this is kind of at an ecosystem level, but incorporating more kind of ecosystem information context. There's also some other projects going on that are more stock specific for managers, but this is kind of a high level. We're trying to tell you what's going on in the system, and then you know, however they use that information. We're also working with the Mid-Atlantic Council right now to operationalize the SOE or the State of the Ecosystem Report, and hopefully we'll be having a meeting to help prioritize what research interests should be explored further that will give the managers as much information as they want about these topics. in the most useful format.
Understood. Thank you. Um, so next question, can you talk a little bit about the decrease in commercial fishery diversity, but the increase in adult fish diversity in the Gulf of Maine? Why might those trends be opposite one another?
Yeah, so the increasing trend in the adult fish we really believe is due to warmer water species moving into the Gulf of Maine, um, while the decrease in fisheries landing is really because the number of species that are targeted in the Gulf of Maine is pretty low. It's really driven by um, a lobster. The lobster industry is very dominant there, and as warmer water species move in, those interactions may increase, and there may be a shift to fishing more for those warmer water species, but we're not seeing that happen just yet.
Great, thank you. How do you treat data sets that are less than 30 years of duration?
Yeah, so for those, we do not apply the trend line. There's some work going on to figure out how to really talk about what those trends are, but at this point, we don't apply those trend lines, and we're just describing whether or not that time series is above or below the long-term average, which is just the average of the time series. Yeah, sorry.
Great, thanks. All good, all good. Next question. I'm curious if the installation of thousands of wind farm foundations will cause a regime shift by raising benthic habitat into the pelagic region. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, as I said, there's a ton of work going on around wind development currently happening at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and many other organizations across um, our region. I do know that there's a few different types of wind structure attachment styles, and I think that those impacts will really depend on what type of turbine.
Did we lose you, Kim, or am I the only one who can't hear you? Okay, I think I'm the only one who can't hear you, so keep talking. Oh, it sounds like everyone can't hear Kim right now. So
Okay,
Kim, I'll let you know. Oh, you're back. I hear you now.
I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi just sputtered. Yes, so there's a ton of work being done on offshore wind and how those interactions will differentially impact species and different fisheries is definitely being explored.
Okay, great. Thank
Sorry about
you.
that.
No worries, no worries. Okay, I'm going to give people about 30 seconds to write down any last questions that they have because I believe we've answered what I can see here. Um, Kim, is there anything that you would like people to take away from this? If it's just one thing.
Yeah, if anything that you found was interesting or relevant to whatever everyone else is working on, those reports are available online right now. So if you are interested, read the whole thing because this is really just a snapshot of what was available in those. Definitely didn't cover everything. And a more cohesive story for each region is available in the individual report. So definitely read those if you found anything interesting today.
Great, thanks. And there was one last question that came in. For the environmental justice indicators, you mentioned population composition. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so the population composition, I will have to double check with the folks who run that analysis. That is a social science that I don't fully have the understanding of. But to my understanding, it is a analysis of kind of demographics in a community that will tell you something about how that community will be able to adapt to change. I don't exactly know how that's calculated, but it is in the glossary, a more like thought out definition. And I can definitely shoot me an email if you still have that question, and I can point you to the folks who have the answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. This was an excellent presentation. You've gotten multiple kudos in the chat here. So I want to thank you for this and the awesome slide deck that everyone could follow along with. I want to thank our audience for coming in today. As I said at the beginning, we did record this, so the presentation is up on the library's YouTube. I did put that in the chat. It'll probably be up there in the next couple hours. If not, within 24 hours, we'll have this up. And you can, of course, take this presentation link and share it around. I hope everyone has a safe, wonderful rest of their Wednesday. Take care, and thank you again, Kim.
Thanks so much, everyone.